Okay, thank you. Thank you, and thank you to everybody in the room. And I apologize that I can't be there today, but I really look forward to the discussion and the presentations. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me know when this is up. It'll take a moment just to get organized. And as I said earlier, we are a not-for-profit, and we are funded by the waste owners. And again, that is required under the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act. It stipulates in the act that the waste owners, so in other words, the utilities that are creating the used nuclear fuel, must fund the organization. And so that is how the organization is structured. When we went out and spoke to Canadians and Indigenous peoples back again in the 2000s, what we heard were some various themes that I'll go through. So first of all, as it relates to dealing with Canada's used nuclear fuel, we heard across the board that the key criteria, the key factor is that safety and security must be the main focus, and that we must ensure that we can build a repository in a way that is safe and secure. We also repeatedly heard, and we still hear that quite a bit now, that we need to assume the responsibility now. That this generation benefited, if you will, from the uses of nuclear energy, and therefore we also must assume the responsibility. We also know that we needed to ensure that the project aligns with international best practice. And so, if you're looking for information on that, you can go to the IAEA website, or the International Atomic Energy Agency website. And there are many documents that speak to the investigations and the studies that have gone on internationally over decades to look for what the best solution is. And as it relates to used nuclear fuel, the consensus internationally is that the best thing to do is to deposit it and safely store it deep underground in deep geologic repositories. And I'll speak a little bit more about that as we go on. And then the last thing that we've heard as well is that our approach must be adaptable. And what do we mean by that? We mean that we have to be able to adapt the approach to advances in science and advances in societal expectations, and that we have to be flexible in terms of how the approach is handled. And because it does occur over, the project has such a long time span over decades, we have to have that flexibility to adapt as new things are learned, as new approaches come to the forefront. So how does a deep geological repository work, and how does it protect people in the environment? So I'll just kind of walk you through this at a high level. So if you look over to I'm going to kind of start over to the right where you see the A, B, C, D. So DGR would have some surface facilities, and what you see there is just a very kind of quick picture of that. So you would have, because of course the facility is deep, you would have shafts that would go down to the depth. And we're looking at a depth anywhere in the 500 meter to 650 meter range, depending on the geology of the particular area. And so you would have some shafts that would go underground. And then what you see in all the little gray kind of areas is that you would have a whole system underground of emplacement rooms and emplacement aisles. So again, the used nuclear fuel would be put in the shaft, descended down underground, and placed in each one of these emplacement rooms. At the surface, you have various facilities, of course, that have to support the operation. And one of the facilities you have at the surface is a used fuel packaging plant, in which the fuel is put in its final container. And I'll speak to that as well in a minute. So again, that's kind of the general layout. Of course, you'd have much more detailed design and engineering that would go along with that, but that gives you a sense of what the facility would look like. And so really what you're relying on is what we call a multiple barrier system in order to protect people in the environment. So I'm going to walk through that multiple barrier system. So again, if you go over to the left of the slide. So the first thing is actually the fuel pellet. So the fuel, the used nuclear fuel, is a solid material. It's a solid ceramic material. It is not a liquid. And when that fuel is put into the reactors, it's first placed in what you see here, which is called a fuel bundle. And that's a stainless steel sheathed bundle, and they put several fuel pellets within each bundle. When the bundle comes out of the reactor after having been in there about 18 months, it is radioactive. It is also thermally hot, and it sits in a pool for 10 years, at least 10 years, at the stations in order to cool, and then it goes to dry storage. By the time most of the fuel will come to the repository, some of it will be approaching 50 years of dry storage. So the fuel bundle, though itself, so again, the fuel itself is a ceramic, and so it does not dissolve in water. It's very stable. And then the fuel bundle itself provides another layer as well of protection. And then each one of these bundles will be put in a used fuel container. And that used fuel container will be coated with copper. And we know that, and that's for resistance to corrosion. And we also know that copper in nature has very high corrosive resistance. So again, that provides another layer of protection. And then underground in each one of those rooms that I described earlier, the fuel will be placed within bentonite clay buffer boxes. And bentonite is chosen because it has a very unique property, an important property, so that if bentonite is in contact with water, it swells and it actually seals. And so that, again, protects it and provides another layer. And then surrounding, of course, the bentonite is going to be the actual rock, the geosphere, the geology that you're trying to use as your ultimate containment. And then finally, your last barrier is depth. As I mentioned earlier, this repository would be at a depth of about at least 500 meters. And so you're relying on that significant depth from the surface to protect the fuel from the biosphere, from the atmosphere. So we often get questions about how do we ensure that the water is protected, for example. So what you need in order for there to be a breach of some sort, water would have to get to the depth of the repository. It would have to infiltrate every one of those layers, and then it would have to get to the fuel pellet ultimately, and start dissolving the fuel pellet. And that would take an inordinate amount of time. And then that water that has now been in contact with the fuel pellet would now have to come back through each one of these layers. It would have to get through the pellet, back through the bundle, back through the copper, through the bentonite, and make its way all the way back up into the atmosphere. And so it's a very long, tortuous process to get to that point. And it's, again, all of those layers that provide you that level of defense. So we often talk about the fact that we will only proceed in an area that is safe. So that is the first criteria. First and foremost, we have to ensure that the geology and that the site that we would be putting this in could hold this facility safely. And we would have to demonstrate this with a very thorough safety case to the regulator. And I'll speak to that later in the presentation. But the other criteria as well that we look for, first of all, safety is a go, no go. If the geology and the studies we did in an area demonstrated that this could not be done in a safe way, that we could not develop a strong safety case, then we would simply not proceed in that area. Assuming you then have a safety case that can be developed, then the next big criteria is that we'll only proceed in an area with informed and willing host communities. And of course, we'll be talking about that quite a bit today as well. And what we mean by that is where the municipality, the First Nations, the Métis communities, and others in the area are working together to implement it. And we've been very, very clear on that, that we will not proceed without informed and willing host communities. And so again, what's very important to our work is the engagement and the participation that we do, and the cooperation and the work that we do with communities. Over the course of the last 10 years, the process started as a volunteer process, the siting process, and communities across Canada were able to come forward and say that they were interested in learning more about the process. And initially, 22 communities came forward and said they were interested in learning more. And over the course of the last 10 years, we've been narrowing down those communities through looking at both things like desktop studies of the geology, looking at the social conditions in the community and whether we believed that there would be support in that area or not, And so there's been this narrowing down process to the point where now we are down to 2 remaining areas. So of course, the area that many of you are sitting in today, the area in the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation traditional territory and in the Ignace area, and in southern Ontario within Saugeen Ojibwe Nation traditional territory and the South Bruce area. So those are the 2 remaining sites that we are currently investigating. So if we look at the timeline, we recently announced that we are pushing our site selection date slightly into 2024. So we're currently aiming to have a decision made between those 2 areas by fall of 2024. And we're working very hard to move towards that date. Once that site selection decision is made, that is just then the beginning, actually, of a lengthy regulatory decision-making process. And I'll go through some of that in detail. And I think I heard in the opening remarks that CNSC and Impact Assessment Agency may be there. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly who's in the room. So I may be repeating some of what they said, but I'll go through that information next. But just at a high level, if you look at this timeline, again, starting at the left. So again, the next thing we would have to do once we select a site would be to enter the regulatory decision-making process. And that involves primarily 2 federal agencies, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, or what used to be called the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, or CEA. And so you can see here from the timeline that shortly after selecting the site, we would then submit a project description to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and that would, if you will, launch or kickstart the impact assessment process. I'm going to stick around the top of the timeline here just for simplicity's sake, and then I'll go to the bottom. We assume for planning purposes that we would have an impact assessment approved in 2030. Again, those are for our planning purposes. That's still something that we'd have to work with the IAC agency with, and we'd simply have to go through the entire process on that. And for planning purposes, we assume then that we would start design and construction in 2033. It's about a 10-year construction period, so that we're assuming that we would start operations in about 2043. So again, you can see that it's a quite long, significant project timeline. And then at the bottom of the screen, you can see here that we also plan, long before we even get impact assessment approval, to open a center of expertise in the hosting community. And I'll speak about that for a moment. The Center of Expertise is meant to be a hub in the community. It would be where we would house many of our employees. It would become NWMO's head office. That head office, therefore, would transition from its current location in Toronto to the host community. But it's really also, so it's going to be a center for science, technology, research, and the work that we would need to do. But it's also meant to be a center that really serves as a hub for the community, and that has community space and spaces that the community can utilize for various purposes. And we're currently going through a visioning exercise on what that center of expertise could look like. So we would intend to move very quickly on that and start construction of that and open that center of expertise in 2028. Now, I'm going to speak about this on some of the next slides, but the next thing that you see that says 2032 license to construct, there are actually several licenses that we need from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So I'm going to speak about that actually on some next slides. So I'm going to go through this in a bit of detail. And again, I apologize if IAC is in the room and they'll be going through this. And I certainly do not want to speak on their behalf. I just wanted to highlight, so again, who are the different agencies that are involved in the review of this and who ultimately have to make the regulatory decision. All the information I'm showing here came from IAC's website, so it's publicly available, and I gave the reference there. It's under the General Government of Canada website. So IAC's role is to assess projects for both positive and negative environmental, social, economic, and health impacts. But I'm just going to spend a moment, and I'm sure if IAC is there, they're going to go through the same thing. So I'll try to go fairly quickly. But the roles of those involved in that process. So NWMO, we would be the proponent. We would be the ones seeking approval for the project. And in order to do that, we have to submit significant amounts of information, quite detailed studies, obviously all the geoscience studies, environmental baseline studies, but also quite a bit of information in terms of social impacts. We have to look at impacts from health, and that includes everything from various determinants of health, including things like mental health. We'd have to look at socioeconomic impacts. So there's quite a significant submission that has to go to the Impact Assessment Agency in order for them to fully assess this project. There would be other experts and other scientists from other government organizations that would also review the information. Some would be third-party reviewers, some would be government agency reviewers that would have to review the project and also provide information. Indigenous groups and of course the indigenous communities such as Wabigoon Lake would be very, very involved in the impact assessment. They have to contribute their expertise, their knowledge and their information, and they need to speak to possible impacts on their community and on their treaty rights. Members of the public are very much a part of the process, of the regulatory decision-making process. Members of the public are able to participate and are able to provide local knowledge, share their insights, their concerns, and are very much a very active part of the process. There's typically an integrated review panel. So this would be a panel of experts that would be overseeing the actual impact assessment and would be holding public hearings on the project. And finally, Governor and Council would be reviewing the final impact report and determining whether the project is in the public interest. So it's quite an extensive process. Again, I'll just comment a little bit further on the Impact Assessment Agency process. So again, as I said, it's a public process, absolutely includes public participation. Once the impact assessment process is complete, the Governor and Council issues a decision document, and this is a legally binding document. If the project is approved, then this decision document will include significant conditions the proponent must adhere to. And one of the key conditions is that the proponent, NWMO, would have to develop and carry out a follow-up program in consultation with the Indigenous groups and relevant authorities. And those conditions would be included in a CNSC license, and those conditions would be tracked and monitored, and they would have to be reported on. I'm going to speak briefly as well about the CNSC, but more from a perspective of what we as the project proponent would have to do. So the CNSC is an independent regulator. They are independent from NWMO. We as the project proponent would have to seek several licenses from the CNSC throughout that long time span that I showed earlier. So very first and foremost, we would have to seek a license to prepare the site. So even to just set up road infrastructure and electrical infrastructure and just grading of the site, those kinds of activities, we would need a license from the regulator in order to do that. To then move to the next stage where you're actually constructing the facility, the above surface facility, the underground works, we would need a separate license to construct the facility. And before any used fuel is even put underground, we would need a license to operate the facility. Every one of those licenses goes through a public process and public hearings. And every one of those licenses requires us again to submit significant amounts of information and to make sure that we are meeting all the requirements of the CNSC licenses. And that doesn't just include, I would say, the General Act or the general licenses, but also things like nuclear security. We need to make sure we'd be meeting all the nuclear security regulations, the radiation protection regulations. There's quite a host of regulations that we would have to demonstrate that we would be meeting. And when the CNSC issues licenses, if it approves those licenses, it provides the proponent or the operator, NWMO, we would get a detailed license condition handbook that specifies all the conditions we would have to meet in all three of those stages of the project, what reporting we have to do to the regulator, what monitoring requirements we have to meet. So it's quite an extensive, detailed license in terms of what we have to meet. And throughout that entire process, I've been focusing on Impact Assessment Agency of Canada and Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. But as I mentioned earlier, there are many, many other federal agencies that would be involved throughout those various processes. And I've just listed some of them. So where things may go into their jurisdiction, they would absolutely be brought in for their expertise, for their knowledge, for their review of some of the material. And various provincial regulators would also be involved on certain specific project items. So for example, you would need, for example, environmental compliance approvals from the provincial Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Parks. I hope I got their name correct. It's changed a few times. So there would be various provincial regulators as well that have to oversee the project. So that is my presentation. Apologize, it'll take me a moment to stop sharing here, and certainly look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations and to speaking to people. Thank you.
So I'm going to give a quick couple of slides on high-level waste and the waste framework in Canada. So in Canada, radioactive waste can be defined as any liquid, gas, or solid which contains a radioactive nuclear substance, so something that is radioactive, and for which there is no foreseeable use. In Canada, we have 4 classifications of nuclear waste. There is uranium mine and mill waste, which is the byproduct of the uranium mining and milling. There is low-level radioactive waste, which contains minimal amounts of radioactive substances. It's things like boots and gloves that have been used to clean reactor facilities. These generally do not require shielding for the workers. Then there's intermediate level waste, which contains more radioactive substances. And common radioactive intermediate level waste forms are things like resins and filters, which are used in nuclear power plants to clean the water. This category also includes medical isotopes and radioactive sources that are used in radiation therapy for treating cancer. Intermediate level waste generally requires more protection and more isolation, and the workers that are handling intermediate level waste typically have to wear protective equipment. And then the final category is high level waste, which is the main focus of today. So high level waste is mainly used nuclear fuel from nuclear power plants. In a nuclear power reactor, fresh uranium goes into the reactor. It undergoes a process called fission, which is a method to generate heat and electricity, and then after which it comes out of the reactor and it's put into something called a spent fuel bay. After it comes out of the reactor, it is very radioactive, so the spent fuel bay allows for the shielding of the workers, because water protects against radiation, as well as provide cooling for the fuels, because the fuel is physically hot as it comes out of the reactor, and the radiation that it emits causes heat generation. After the 7 to 10 year period in the spent fuel bay, it is moved to a concrete canister. The design of these canisters vary depending on the facility that you go to, but the one on the slide is called a dry storage container, and these are used at Ontario power generation sites. That's where the fuel is currently stored. So at site right now, all the used nuclear fuel are stored in these dry storage containers, or sometimes they're max stores depending on the facility. Although the radioactivity level of this fuel decreases relatively quickly in the first 10 years, so in the first 10 years it goes down by 99%, it takes about another 1,000,000 years for it to decrease to the original level of natural uranium. So this is why there is a solution is required for the storage of used nuclear fuel. Anyways, I'm going to move on to the CNSC. So as I said earlier, CNSC is Canada's nuclear regulator. Anytime there is a radiation or nuclear-related facility, the CNSC comes in. We make sure that it's regulated and safe. We're Canada's nuclear regulator, which means that we independently regulate the use of nuclear energy and materials to protect the health, safety, security, and the environment. Our second part of the mandate is to implement implement our international commitments on the peaceful use of nuclear energy, and to disseminate scientific, technical, and regulatory information to the public, which is what we're doing today. We are an independent federal authority. We're not the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. We don't submit projects for approval. We don't care how much money a project will make. We only care about protecting the health and safety of the public and the environment. Safety continues to be CNSC's #1 priority. As for how we actually work at the CNSC is composed of 2 components. There's the Independent Commission and CNSC staff. The Commission is the independent decision maker. They have no influence from the nuclear industry. The Commission is composed of members with various backgrounds. So we have doctors, geologists, lawyers, a whole range of technical backgrounds. Recent additions to the commission include Ms. Indira Maharaj, who was previously an environmental lawyer, Mr. Randall Kagi, who was the previous chief of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, and Dr. Remenda, who was the previous head of CNSC's Independent Advisory Group. Then there is CNSC staff, which is what I'm part of. CNSC staff performs several functions, such as conducting expert research and analysis, conducting inspections of licensees, conducting activities to enforce licensee compliance, so issuing orders or revoking licenses, and when necessary, we appear before the commission commission proceedings to answer questions. CNSC staff is made up of experts such as radiation and environmental protection specialists, nuclear physicists and engineers, geologists, and other various scientific disciplines. Most of CNSC staff work in Ottawa and at our headquarters or laboratory, but CNSC also has site offices at all the nuclear facilities across Canada, as well as 4 regional offices. So CNSC regulates the nuclear industry across Canada. As to what we regulate the entire nuclear fuel cycle, which means everything from uranium mining and milling, transportation of the milled product, uranium fuel processing, all the way to nuclear power plants and radioactive waste. We also regulate nuclear substances and radiation devices that are used in the academic research, industrial, and medical centers. As to actually how we regulate, the CNSC is first governed by the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. This gives us outlines the broad powers that the CNSC has to regulate the nuclear industry. Then there are the regulations, which goes into more specific details as to how we regulate the industry. And then there are the licenses of the licensees. So this contains a rule book of how they should operate the facility and the requirements that they need to obey in order to continue operating. And then there are regulatory documents which go into the specifics on how they should accomplish that task. CNSC's commitment to Indigenous people and the public. So the CNSC is an open and transparent regulator. We share all of the information on our website, so CNSC's website. We have a social media page, and we share information through various outreach, community outreach activities such as this one. You can also call our information hotline or email us at any time with any questions or concerns that you have. As an agent of the Crown, it is CNSC's responsibility for meeting the Crown's duty to consult and to come to your communities and to honor the Crown. We are committed to building a long-term positive relationship with Indigenous communities and advancing reconciliation. We are more than happy to come to your communities at any time to listen to concerns that you may have or present on a topical area. As mentioned earlier, CNSC is committed to building a long-term relationship with Indigenous groups who have interest in the facilities that we regulate. We strive to engage in meaningful, ongoing discussions to address concerns throughout the whole life cycle of the project and to support their participation in the CNSC process. We also expect this of CNSC licensees, and we encourage them to engage early and often with Indigenous groups. As for CNSC's activities on the APM project, we are in the pre-licensing phase, which means that we have not received an application from the NWMO to proceed with licensing. NWMO expects to select a site in either South Bruce or Ignace in late 2024, and with 2025 expecting to submit documents to support their integrated impact assessment to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. The timeline to note is not CNSC's timeline. It'll take however long it takes for us to verify safety during the site preparation license application. So the first licensing phase, CNSC staff will review the information received and ensure that it meets CNSC's rigorous regulatory expectations that ensures the health and safety of the people and the environment are protected. I should also note on this slide that each licensing stage, so there's site preparation, construction, operation, closure. Each of those will also require a subsequent licensing decision. So this is not the only decision that will be made. Every step requires going to the commission. There we go. CNSC is also conducting research during this time. Various research projects across the CNSC include investigating the performance of a DGR, so the barrier performance. So there's the natural barrier, which is the host rock, and then there's engineered barriers such as the copper and the bentonite buffer box. CNSC performs independent research from the NWMO to analyze this performance. Something to expect when we're the regulator, if this project goes ahead, is our continued engagement with the communities. If a project goes ahead, we'll have a continuous regulatory role, meaning we'll be conducting inspections of the facility, we'll be performing independent research and data throughout the entire life cycle, we'll be performing independent environmental monitoring, so any nuclear facility in Canada, like a nuclear power plant, we have an independent monitoring program where we go collect samples of data to verify the results and compare them against the licensee to ensure that they are compliant with the environmental guidelines. And we confirm that the safety case is updated throughout the entire lifespan of the facility to ensure that it is correlating with the best possible information at the time. And as for the the first licensing review stage is gonna be performed is under something called One Project, One Review. So there's the Integrated Impact Assessment on Nuclear Designated Projects. Some of you may be familiar with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, but that act was replaced in 2019 with the Impact Assessment Act, which requires certain projects called designated projects undergo an impact assessment. Any nuclear designated projects are automatically referred to an integrated review panel. This process is integrated because it meets the requirements of both the Impact Assessment Act and the Nuclear Safety Control Act, which is the act I aforementioned in our How We Regulate slide. The Impact Assessment Agency would lead the integrated impact assessment, and the CNSC would provide technical knowledge as well as lead the review of the license application. The overall goal is one project, one review. To prepare for the first integrated impact assessment, the CNSC signed a memorandum of understanding with the Impact Assessment Act in 2019, the Impact Assessment Agency in 2019, and the purpose of the memorandum of understanding is to outline the roles and responsibilities of the agency as well as the CNSC. And you can find the memorandum of understanding on our website. So now I'm going to pass the presentation over to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada.
So good morning, and thank you to my colleague Julia from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission for the introduction, to the organizers from the city of Dryden, to the Anishinaabe peoples on whose traditional territory we meet today, and of course to all of you in the room and on the stream for taking the time today to learn a little bit about our Impact Assessment Act. My name is Connor Anderson, and I'm a project manager in the Ontario Regional Office of the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to provide an overview of the Impact Assessment Act, the process, and the integrated assessment process, which is a special kind of impact assessment that applies to certain projects that have a life cycle regulator attached to them, such as nuclear projects. I'll also speak to opportunities for public and Indigenous participation in the process and try to convince you as to why it's important to participate. Okay. Sorry, I'm managing two screens here. All right, so as I noted, I'll talk a little bit about who we are, what we do, the act that created us. I'll talk about the impact assessment process. There's a quick video that is a little bit more interesting than watching me drone on. Then we'll talk about what makes an integrated review panel process unique. Talk about the pre-planning phase where we are technically, it's kind of an unofficial phase that we're in now. Talk about the planning phase, which is the first official phase of impact assessment, and then talk about some next steps. So, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. So, the agency is a federal government body, and we're accountable to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. I think it's important to note that we're not part of Environment and Climate Change Canada. So while we share a minister, we're in the same portfolio, we're actually a separate agency, and our sole purpose is implementing the Impact Assessment Act, which in fact was the act that created our agency. So the impact assessment, the Federal Impact Assessment Agency leads federal assessments, which are designed to contribute to informed decision-making, support sustainable development, and reduce the potential adverse effects of projects. So the Impact Assessment Act, which came into force in August of 2019, so it's still a fairly young piece of legislation, it outlines the process for conducting impact assessments, with the goal of helping the Government of Canada in making its decisions to understand possible impacts of projects before they start, and identifying ways of reducing or eliminating the negative impacts, and in some cases enhancing or augmenting the positive aspects of a project. Ultimately, the goal of our Act is to inform decision makers about potential effects, be those positive or negative effects to the environment, to economic, health, or social conditions, and potential impacts to Indigenous peoples and their rights as protected by the Constitution Act 1982. So with that, we'll go to our short video, and I will hope that it works here without a hitch. Oh, maybe not.
If a major project was proposed near where you live, what potential impacts would matter most to you? The Impact Assessment Agency of Canada evaluates impacts of proposed major projects. Through the impact assessment process, we seek comments from various people, including different levels of government, non-governmental organizations, Indigenous groups, and the public. During the first phase, we ask people to identify key issues. We also determine what needs to be assessed and how people want to participate. We look at positive and negative impacts and determine if the project needs an assessment. In the second phase, the project developer follows established guidelines. It conducts studies and consults with various people to prepare an impact statement. This sets out the potential impacts of the project and how some can be reduced. In the next phase, we use the impact statement to prepare a report that draws on science, Indigenous knowledge, and public and Indigenous community input. In the fourth phase, the minister or government in council uses the impact assessment report to determine if the project is in the public interest. If yes, the minister establishes conditions to reduce negative impacts that the developer must legally meet. In the last phase, we verify and enforce compliance of the conditions. As you've seen, a range of views and information is key for a thorough impact assessment. Learn more about how you can have your say.
All right, back on track. So that short video, which with a much better soundtrack than I have here, outlined the 5 major phases of impact assessment. So I'll recap them briefly. In the planning phase, we determine whether an impact assessment of a proposal is required. That's phase number 1 on the slide. If an assessment is required, we look at how we will cooperate with other jurisdictions, how the public will be engaged during the process, how Indigenous communities will be engaged, any federal permits that are required, and the scope of the assessment. So what are the studies and information that needs to be provided to the proponent? In phase 2, the impact statement, the proponent will go out and collect that information, create a report that is then submitted. In this case, in the case of the NWMO Adaptive Phase Management Project, that report would be submitted to a panel. In phase 3, a panel would undertake the impact assessment. I'll speak a little bit about the panel process in a few slides from now. Phase 4, the governor and council, or what we usually call cabinet, will decide whether the potential adverse effects of the project are significant and whether the project is in the public interest. And if it is, then it will proceed to phase 5, where, as the NWMO noted this morning, there may be activities such as follow-up and monitoring and compliance to ensure that any conditions that are set by the minister's decision statement are being met by the proponent. Now, one thing I do want to call your attention to on this slide is those little circular icons, which may be hard to see from the back. But you'll notice that there's a lot of participants in this process. And in 4 out of the 5 steps, Indigenous peoples are involved and the public at large. So in particular, in the planning phase, which is the first phase, deciding whether a full impact assessment is required, that's going to be a subject on which we receive input from the public and Indigenous groups. And then understanding what are the key issues and concerns within the community and what are the things that the proponent really needs to provide evidence on is also something on which we welcome the public's input. Now, just to situate ourselves, as has been mentioned already today, the assessment process, the regulatory process for this project has not begun and will not begin until the Nuclear Waste Management Organization selects a site. So we anticipate a site selection would occur sometime in 2024, after which an initial project description would be submitted to the Impact Assessment Agency, which would initiate the Impact Assessment Act and the joint review process by the agency and the CNSC. So I've mentioned that there are opportunities for public participation. You might be thinking, why does it matter? Well, I'm sure if you're in the room, you know why public participation matters. But it's so important to the Government of Canada that in fact, one of the purposes of the Impact Assessment Act is to enable opportunities to provide meaningful public participation during an impact assessment. And it's because it's you, members of the public, that are on the ground and are closest to the project and are going to understand the potential adverse effects of the project, the negatives, the ways it may change your life and the life of your offspring, etc. But you may also be keenly aware of the potential benefits that it may bring to your community, whether that's through things like jobs or through investment in the local communities. Ultimately, the plan for public participation in impact assessments is that the public can have a say in how projects are designed and how any potential negative impacts could be reduced or mitigated. So public participation during impact assessment happens in a number of ways. Our transparency platform, if you will, is the Canadian Impact Assessment Registry. And so that's where all records associated with the project will be shared, including the initial project description that kicks off our process. And then there's a commenting feature there for members of the public to submit comments on the project. And in fact, even federal experts and other reviewers submit their comments through the registry so that the public has access to all of the same information as does the government, or in this case, as does the panel. We look to the public to identify key issues of concern and potential opportunities that could be provided to the public. We will also use our impact assessment registry to post public notices anytime there's a public engagement activity, and certainly when there are public hearings associated with the review panel process. So I've talked, I'll speak to this on the next slide. Thank you. This is awkward. In addition to meaningful public engagement, consultation with Indigenous communities is also important and top of mind for the Impact Assessment Agency. In an integrated assessment process, we share the duty to consult that the CNSC has noted, and in fact, it's the agency that is the Crown Consultation Coordinator for the purposes of the Impact Assessment Act. We seek to work with Indigenous peoples to advance reconciliation. And we also encourage proponents to build trusted relationships with Indigenous communities to foster reconciliation and integrate Indigenous knowledge in the impact assessment process. And in fact, the Impact Assessment Act requires that any Indigenous knowledge that is available to the government, to the panel, or to the proponent is included and informs the ultimate report that's provided to Governor and Council, well, to the Minister and referred to Governor and Council. So I've noted things that the agency does to foster meaningful public engagement and Indigenous engagement, but I should note that in parallel, the proponent is expected to be undertaking public and Indigenous engagement, even prior to beginning the planning phase. So the proponent is, I understand, is already undertaking public and Indigenous engagement, and that will continue through all stages of the project, including if the project is approved, through the carrying out and implementation of the project. Some opportunities that the proponent could offer Indigenous communities is the chance to co-develop portions of the impact statement that outlines the potential impacts of the project. and allowing both Indigenous communities and the public to have input on the potential mitigation measures, as I've noted, for the potential impacts of the project, both impacts to people and also for Indigenous communities, specifically potential impacts on their rights. The proponent is also encouraged to provide opportunities for participation in the monitoring and follow-up activities that would follow the carrying out of a project if approved. So if you're thinking, well, that all sounds great, but I don't know how to participate, I don't have the capacity. Well, there is participant funding available, which could be used to compensate an expert reviewer and support your organizations. This becomes available during the planning phase, so once the impact assessment process has begun, and there are grants offered both for the review of the initial project description and then also for the review of the tailored impact statement guidelines should an impact assessment be required. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about integrated assessments, and I keep talking about this panel, so I'm going to explain now what it is about integrated assessments that makes them unique. So anytime a project includes activities that are regulated under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, our minister is required or obligated under our act to refer the assessment to a review panel. Such projects are referred to a review panel in recognition of the complexity of projects in the nuclear sector and the large public interest or high degree of public interest in these types of projects. What is it that makes an integrated review panel different? Well, the impact assessment will not be conducted by the agency. It will be conducted by an independent group of experts, including at least one member put forward from a roster of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. The panel of experts will conduct the assessment, hold a public hearing, and prepare the report, the impact assessment report, that will contain conclusions and advice to the decision makers. That same independent panel will be responsible for making the initial licensing decisions under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. As Julia mentioned, the agency and the CNSC do have an agreement or a memorandum of understanding that outlines how we will work together in conducting integrated assessments in order to achieve the principle of one project, one assessment. And as Julia noted, you can find this on both websites, or both IAA's website, IAC's website and the CNSC's website. So we'll talk a little bit more about how the review panel is formed. So as I've noted, they are independent experts. So when we say they're independent, that means the members of the review panel are not government employees, they're not public servants. Often they're academics, consultants, or field-specific experts. And the panel operates outside of government influence. So once the review panel has been appointed, the federal government is essentially just another participant in the independent review process and won't have any insight into the final recommendations of the panel until that panel publicly releases its report. Members of the review panel are selected based on some criteria. So in order to form a part of the review panel, a member must have knowledge or experience related to the potential effects of the project, so they should be an expert in the field, or knowledge of the interests and concerns of Indigenous peoples related to the assessment. And that reviewer also must be unbiased and free of any conflict of interest. So, members of the nuclear industry, for instance, may not be able to be members of the panel. In the case of an integrated review with the CNSC, one member of the panel, at least one member of the panel, needs to be put forward from a roster of individuals selected by the CNSC for their nuclear expertise. However, the CNSC roster members cannot form the majority of panel members. As I've noted, once the review panel is formed, it's the panel that's responsible for conducting the impact assessment, which includes collecting information and holding the public hearing. So the public hearing is a key component of the review panel process. It provides an opportunity for participants to provide their views directly to the integrated review panel. And those participants include experts and also members of the public and Indigenous communities. And that hearing may be organized into different separate sessions, such as technical sessions, general sessions, or community sessions with Indigenous groups. Often public hearings are located in the communities that are most likely to be impacted by the project, so that it's in order to facilitate participation by those members or those persons that are most likely to feel the effects of the project. Following the panel hearing, the review panel will prepare its report outlining its conclusions and recommendations to Governor and Council under the Impact Assessment Act and making the initial licensing decisions under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. Again, that's with this goal of achieving one project, one assessment. However, before we get to the review panel process, which would begin, the panel begins to form really in phase 2 of impact assessment as the proponent is collecting, creating its impact statement. And then the panel, of course, leads phase 3, the impact assessment phase. But on our way there, there's 2 phases that are led from the Ontario Regional Office, which is why yours truly is speaking today. So those are the pre-planning phase and the planning phase. And I'm going to speak about those in reverse chronological order. So I'll talk about where we're headed, the planning phase, and then what we can do now as we prepare to enter that phase. There we go. So my animations are going to appear here. So during the planning phase is initiated, pressing the wrong keyboard, by the submission of an initial project description. So the initial project description is created by the proponent, by the NWMO, and I'll talk about the contents of that in a couple of slides, but essentially it outlines what is being proposed. If the initial project description meets the regulations, the Information and Management of Time Limits regulations, which essentially is a minimum marking rubric, if you will, of the information that needs to be included in an initial project description, it will be posted on our Canadian Impact Assessment Registry, and a comment period would be the first step. A public engagement period is the first step in the impact assessment process. During that engagement period, we're looking to hear from members of the public, from Indigenous communities, from provincial ministries, from federal experts, and from any other interested parties as to the potential impacts of the project, whether the proponent has correctly characterized the potential impacts in the initial project description, whether they've left things out, what are your hopes, your fears, your concerns about the project. Upon completion of that comment phase, the Impact Assessment Agency will prepare a document called a Summary of Issues. This is essentially kind of a list of the key concerns and the key issues that were raised during that comment period, and that's provided to the proponent, to the NWMO, for their response. The proponent will then have 30 days, although I'll note that the proponent does have the option to pause the timeline. What we're looking for is a robust and reasoned response from the proponent, and so if they need more than 30 days to develop that response, then they can take that under our Act. But the proponent is going to create something called a detailed project description, which builds on the initial project description based on the information that has come to light during that first comment period. And it importantly includes responses to the summary of issues. So the proponent will outline how it intends to address the concerns that were raised. In some cases, in some projects, a proponent can adequately address, show that there are regulatory processes, or show that it has mitigation options for all of the effects that have been raised. In those cases, the agency may determine that no impact assessment is required. For a complex project or a project with another life cycle regulator, it's most likely that an impact assessment would be required. And so if an impact assessment is required, then that determination would be posted to the public registry, and in the case of the adaptive phase management project, as the minister is obligated to refer the assessment to a review panel, the referral to the review panel would also happen somewhere around the middle of the planning phase, typically around day 80. So subsequent then to that first phase of the planning phase, that's where we get into the planning portion. So the impact assessment is required, and the agency will develop, in consultation with the CNSC, draft documents that will describe how we will cooperate with other jurisdictions, including the province of Ontario, what federal permits are required. So as noted, there may be DFO permits or ACCC permits. How Indigenous communities will be engaged and participate in the assessment, how the public will be participate in the assessment, And then the tailored impact statement guidelines, which are what I've noted, that's the scoping document. That tells the proponent, these are the concerns, these are the issues that you need to go out, study, and report back on in your impact statement report. That process typically takes around 100 days, in which the draft versions of these documents will be created, and there will be a public comment period on those drafts. So the public, Indigenous communities, federal experts, and provincial ministers, or provincial ministries rather, will have the opportunity to provide feedback and expertise in order to finalize those documents, which will then be provided to the proponent at the end of the planning phase, and we'll move into the impact statement phase when the proponent will collect the information that's required of it in those tailored impact statement guidelines. I won't speak to phase 2 now because frankly we're many years away from that phase at the time, and as we get into a formal impact assessment process, there will be those public engagement activities where we'll look at where we are and where we're going next. So phase 1 is really where we're going next. And I'll talk now in 1 second about what we can do as we prepare to enter. I do want to just note that I was remiss and I did not note that that grant funding that I mentioned earlier is released both for the review of the initial project description, so on the previous slide, and then also for the review of these 5 plans that are created. So the public would be invited to provide overview or input into the tailored impact statement guidelines in the public participation plan, Indigenous communities into the tailored impact statement guidelines in the Indigenous engagement and partnership plan, federal authorities into the tailored impact statement guidelines in the permitting plan, and then the province, the cooperation plan, and those tailored impact statement guidelines. Okay, so the next step in order to activate or begin our impact assessment process is the submission of an initial project description. So that is a document that is prepared by the NWMO, the proponent, and it includes a description of the project and its location, the existing conditions, be they environmental, health, social, or economic, potential effects, and any Indigenous, federal, or provincial or municipal involvement. The summary of the initial project description will also be created, which is a plain language summary. Both documents will be posted to the Canadian Impact Assessment Registry, so the public will have access to all the same information as will expert reviewers, but the summary is just meant to be a slightly easier to digest version. At this phase, because there's no impact assessment, the Impact Assessment Agency is not actively soliciting comments on this project, and instead recommends that any comments on the project be provided to the proponent such that it can inform the proponent's initial project description. If you do choose to engage with the proponent and provide comments, you should consider providing your comments thinking about the environment holistically. So the components of the environment such as air, water, land, how do these interact to enable community well-being and ecological well-being? Oh, sorry, I missed the slide here. So here we see those components, air, water, land, and so when we're thinking about air, we're thinking about sound, light, and air quality. When we're thinking about water, we're thinking about water quality, navigation, fish and fish habitat. When we're thinking about land, we're thinking about vegetation, species, etc. And then, of course, slightly to the outside, as you'll see in this figure, the way we use those resources is also important. I've noted that the Impact Assessment Act also considers health, social, and economic impacts, and so you can also consider providing comments on these areas: economic effects, social effects such as strain to social services, or potential opportunities for investment in social services, impacts to health, mental health or physical health, and how all of these realms combine to enable your personal well-being and your community's well-being. So I noted that we're not actively soliciting comments on the project. However, as we are beginning to do pre-assessment engagement, and as we plan for that first comment period in the planning phase, the agency is keen to hear from your communities about how you want to be engaged. What are the platforms and methods, locations that best work for you? And so we would be very keen to hear your suggestions as to whether in-person or virtual meetings are appropriate. But we also encourage you to share, of course, that feedback with the proponent, as the proponent should be engaging your communities actively at the present time. Okay, so my last two slides, and you'll be rid of me. Some next steps. So as I've noted, we're not in the formal assessment process yet. That will occur once site selection has been completed. But we are in sort of an informal pre-assessment phase where we're available to build capacity for impact assessment, to explain our process, and to begin establishing the important relationships with your communities and with Indigenous groups, so that we can ensure that the impact assessment is successful. Once the site has been selected and the initial project description is submitted to our agency, the agency and the CNSC will notify the public, both via public notice, via direct mail if you are interested, that the initial project description has been accepted and that the impact assessment process has begun with a public comment period. So, if I can leave you with a few take-home messages, at the risk of repeating this next sentence ad nauseum, the impact assessment, the regulatory process, has not begun, and it will begin once the NWMO has selected a site. So if you have concerns about, that you haven't had a chance to voice your opinions about the project, or you don't agree with which communities are allowed to provide input, I'll just note that the regulatory process is yet to come, and you can provide input, and you will have your opportunity to inform the assessment. So the agency and CNSC will notify the public if there are any upcoming phases in the impact assessment process, such as opportunities for capacity building or for training. And I'll note that you will hear from us prior to the submission of an initial project description, as we expect to begin, so that we can begin to put some of that grant funding, earmark some of that grant funding, and ensure that folks are ready to review the document and provide comments in that first comment period. You can visit my colleague Ian and myself at our booth in the lobby if you would like to sign up for our distribution list, and then you will be on our email list. We don't have a formal newsletter or anything like that, but we will send you a notice when major milestones are met. On my slide, you also can see my name, Connor Anderson. Again, I'm the project manager for the Ontario Regional Office. We'll be leading the pre-planning and planning phases of the assessment, and we have a project-specific inbox that you can write to there. It's nuclear waste-déchets nucléaires at iac.gc.ca. And with that, that's all for me, and I will turn the floor back to my colleagues here.
Scott, do you have the mic back there? I think there is a Q&A at the end, but I'm not sure if you wanted to wait till the end, Scott, or not. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Anderson. So, good morning, bon matin. My name is Eric Lemoyne, and I'm the Director of Transport Licensing and Strategic Support at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. I'm in the Directorate of Nuclear Substance Regulation. So what does all that mean? Well, anyway, from a transport perspective, we look after the assessments and certifications of packages, not just for waste and used fuel, but packages that are required that need to be certified in order to ship nuclear materials and nuclear substances in Canada. And with me here today is Raj Garg. Maybe online this won't work, but Raj, if you could just wave your hand. So Raj is down there, and this will become a little bit clearer throughout the presentation. So Raj is one of the people that does the assessments of packages. And we also have François Dagenet, who is over there in the corner. He is a transport officer, and they're both inspectors, but in particular, transport officers and Francois, they go and do inspections of carriers and licensees to make sure that our regulations are being met. So the three of us will be available at the booth throughout the day today and tomorrow if you want to ask us questions. So the purpose of the presentation today is really to provide a brief overview of the federal regulatory controls for the transport of nuclear substances in Canada that ensure the safety of the public and the environment. So the transport of nuclear substances, including radioactive waste, is carried out safely in Canada. The overall safety record of the transport of nuclear substances in Canada has historically been excellent. There's never been any serious injuries, overexposure, fatality, or environmental consequences attributable to the radioactive nature of such materials being transported. And this safety record of radioactive material shipments is backed by a stringent regulatory regime that has been in place and under continuous review for more than 60 years. It was actually recognized, very early on in, let's say, the birth of the nuclear industry worldwide, that it was going to be really important to make sure everything was sorted out with transport early on, because there was going to be sort of this international borders and things like that would be crossed. So it was very important early on from the International Atomic Energy Agency to make sure they had things sorted out when it came to the transport of nuclear substances. And you don't really have to take my word for it. There is the International Atomic Energy Agency. They offer a service called the Regulatory Review Service Mission, which we underwent one in 2019. And it assesses regulators basically. And some of our practices when it came to the certification of packages were highlighted as best practices. And that report, I believe there's at least a summary report available on our website where you can see those results. So the United Nations regulations and Transport Canada regulations classify dangerous goods into 9 classes, and class 7 is the one that's related to radioactive material, and that's where the CNSC and our regulations get involved. In addition to the shipment of nuclear fuel cycle products, which is sort of the focus of today, in particular used fuel, right? But there are other ones as well, like uranium ore, uranium hexafluoride, nuclear fuel bundles, and nuclear waste, as I mentioned. It also involves the transport of substances for medical use, industrial uses, such as transport of portable gauges used in construction sites, fixed gauges. There's gauges that actually just measure the level of liquids in bottles, and industrial radiography. There's also a transport of nuclear substances to support academia and research purposes. And then there are commercial services as well that use transportation. For example, if a radiation device needs to be serviced, it needs to be perhaps transported to an authorized service provider. And it's this number is kind of surprising to me when I first learned it, but worldwide there's over 10 million radioactive material packages are safely transported each year. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A if you want. So at the federal level, transport of radioactive material is in Canada is jointly regulated by the CNSC and Transport Canada. There are other players as well, like provincial authorities, who play a role, for example, in performing the actual vehicle inspections. On our website, I don't have it here on the slide, unfortunately. On our website, we have a relatively new infographic that tries to explain who does what in that sort of sandbox, right? Both at the federal and provincial levels. Kind of explains what Transport Canada does, what the CNSC does, what Transport Canada and CNSC do together, and then what the province does. So there's multiple layers to ensure safety. There's international requirements, domestic requirements, and our transport regulations actually incorporate the international requirements, which have been developed over many decades. And there's specific licensing in some cases for higher risk materials, such as used fuel. So for transport of spent nuclear fuel, a license is required that's issued by the CNSC. Nuclear substances must be transported in very specific packaging. There are different types, and the basic premise of transport is that the safety relies heavily on the design of the package. This is sort of the fundamental principle, so the idea doesn't matter what mode of transport you're using. The idea is that the package is safe in both normal operating conditions and in accident conditions. There's different types of packages used to transport radioactive materials, and it depends on the radionuclide, so what's in there, its quantity, and the form, is it solid or is it liquid? So I'll just go over, there's generally two broad categories. There's packages that, sorry, get away from the mic there. There are packages that don't require certification, however, there's still requirements that they have to meet. And when we do inspections, we go and check to make sure that they have documents to assure that they meet those requirements. And then there's packages that need to be certified by the CNSC, which means people like Raj do the assessment and then make a recommendation as to whether or not it should be certified. So on your left, for example, there's a type A package there. This is, I don't know specifically this one, but for things like medical isotopes. And these do not need to be certified. In the middle picture, you can see a package that does need to be certified, and this could be perhaps, again, some sort of isotope that needs to be shipped in bulk material, in bulk form to a place where it'll be processed into perhaps maybe the smaller packages that you see on the left. And then on the right, this is not the package proposed by NWMO to be used to ship fuel to a deep geological repository. However, this is a type B fissile package that would be used to transport used nuclear fuel. There are, of course, additional controls as well. So packages or designs are combined with other regulatory controls, such as the labeling. You have the right stickers on there that explain what it is, the placarding on the outside of the vehicles, and then there's quality assurance and maintenance records that we review as well to make sure that everything's being maintained appropriately. And this all allows nuclear substances to be carried and transported safely in all modes of transport. If you do want to pick up our regulations, so the Packaging and Transport of Nuclear Substance Regulations 2015, there is some language in there. So you'll often hear the word consigner. So this is basically the person who is shipping the materials. They must display the appropriate safety marks and labels and placards that verify, and also they have to have properly trained staff. In the case of an accident, this is going to segue into the other slides after this, the labels on the package and the shipping documents can be used by first responders such as local police and fire to determine the presence and the nature of the material. So while we have a really great, perhaps, history, we don't want to just rely on that, right? The idea is to be prepared for things that are unplanned or eventualities that may occur. So this nuclear emergency preparedness and response in Canada is a multi-jurisdictional responsibility shared by federal, provincial, and municipal governments as well as licensees. Transport Canada regulations require a 24-hour emergency telephone number on the shipping document to ensure that the appropriate technical assistance is immediately available to emergency responders. There's also a 24-hour number that is, it's called CANUTEC. It's operated by Transport Canada, and they can offer assistance as well to first responders. And the CNSC, we have duty officers online 24/7 as well who can respond and help persons involved in the remediation of an accident as well. Our staff, so such inspectors such as Raj and Francois, for example, they can go on site if required and provide guidance and oversight. However, we're not first responders. We're not organized to be the first responders on scene necessarily for a transport event. So Raj and Francois are very knowledgeable in this area as well. However, there's actually a whole different division that looks after security at the CNSC. It's called the Nuclear Security Division. So if we can't answer your questions today about that specifically, we'll take an action and forward them on to the correct people. In some cases, such as it's not in every case of a transport of nuclear substances, but used fuel in particular, a security plan is required by the nuclear security regulations. And this includes, for example, threat assessment information, proposed security measures such as vehicle anti-theft devices, escort requirements, continuous tracking, and other administrative security measures. And information on specific shipment details, such as the schedule and the route, is limited because of the sensitive nature. So compliance activities, so CNSC inspectors, we ensure compliance with the regulations through inspections of the package certificate holders, the users of the package, and the carriers. So the carriers would be the trucks or the companies that use the trucks to transport nuclear substances. And Raj and Francois, as I mentioned, are both qualified inspectors. There's also provincial inspectors who conduct the roadside inspections of the vehicles themselves. Thank you very much for your time. Like I said, Raj, Francois, and I will be available after the presentation during the day, today and tomorrow, if you'd like to talk or ask us questions about this. And I'll now pass back to Julia.
Thank you. Okay. As for our conclusion, we only have 2 slides left on this. So in summary, Indigenous engagement and public participation are an ongoing commitment, and they are important to the CNSC process. We're happy to receive any concerns that you have today, and we'll be in the hall nearby to talk about how we regulate the nuclear industry. And all the information that we talked about today you can find online. So we have videos on how we regulate, infographics on how we regulate. All that is available on our website. With respect to the NWMO 8 p.m. project, CNSC will continue to engage early with communities such as this. And if a license application is submitted to the CNSC, it'd be subject to a rigorous safety-focused review of the project. And just for a final slide, CNSC staff and the Commission work together to ensure that the public is protected and that we are an independent regulator. Staff review applications and the Commission issue licenses, though in this case, as we heard today, for license prepare site, it'll be an impact assessment panel. The decisions are based on the best available knowledge, which does include traditional Western science as well as Indigenous knowledge, and staff will continue to verify safety and compliance, and we have the ability to take action if needed. We are not the NWMO, so we're not the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, nor are we industry. We don't select sites, so we don't determine if it's Ignace or South Bruce. We don't own, manage, or construct nuclear projects. We don't issue approvals for the boreholes, and we are not for or against nuclear. We do not promote the nuclear industry. Thank you so much for having us here today, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you to Lise, Julia, Eric, and Connor. I do believe that we have at least one question that has come through the online portal, and then after we take care of those, we will pass it on to anyone on the floor that has any questions.
Hello. I'm just going to read to you guys a question that came in online, and then if you have a question in the room, just put your hand up, and I'm happy to bring you the microphone. So this is an anonymous question. Outside of NWMO's willingness decision, will Dryden and surrounding area have their voices and concerns heard before the DGR is built?
I can take that first and then pass it to IAC if they have any additional comment. So the NWMO's definition of a willingness community is not necessarily the CNSC's definition of a willing community. We're not beholden to what they've defined as a community. Our scope is fairly large, and we're happy to hear comments from both Ignace, Dryden, and any Indigenous community in the surrounding area. So as a brief answer, yes, we're happy to hear any opinion and any concern that you have on the project.
Yeah, can you hear me? With regard to the integrated assessment process, there are opportunities, as I've mentioned, for public engagement, and it is the communities that are most likely to be impacted that will probably play host to these public hearing sessions. So I would expect that the City of Dryden would certainly be invited to provide feedback to the panel and inform the panel's report that would eventually inform the Government of Canada's decision.
Hello, it's Lise. I'm not sure. Can you hear me? And did you want me to interject right now?
Or we can hear you okay. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted to indicate that, absolutely we've been very clear that we need a willingness indication from Ignace and from Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation, without whose express willingness and support we will not proceed. Having said that, though, we absolutely will be looking at what is the regional base of support or not, and we are absolutely wanting to engage with Dryden residents and hear their concerns and answer their questions. And I think consistent with what the CNSC and IAC are saying, as we move towards a impact assessment, we would have to be demonstrating the impact on a regional basis. So, and we would have to be discussing that and absolutely addressing concerns and mitigations that Dryden residents would want to see as part of the project. And then I would just point out that, we do have a significant neighboring community agreement with Dryden, which also lays out the fact that we need to do engagement in Dryden. And we've also committed to Dryden that we'll be looking at any specific gaps that that may have occurred as a result of the current IGNACE study. So in other words, are there areas specific to Dryden that we haven't addressed as part of those studies? Do we need some Dryden specific studies to look at those? And so we absolutely are committed to continuing to work with Dryden.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to open the questions to the floor. Please raise your hand and I'm happy to bring the microphone.
Thank you all for your presentations. I sit on the Dryden Nuclear Education and Engagement Committee. My name is Shane McKinnon. I have a question in regards to Impact Assessment Agency. I believe Mr. Anderson, if I'm not mistaken. Can you give us an example where you've worked in concert with the CNSC to review a project, what that project would be, and are the key documents available to the public?
Sure. So with regard to the specific integrated assessment process that I've outlined today, we anticipate that the NWMO would be the first. However, it wouldn't be the first panel review. So there were assessments under our former act, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and I believe my colleague Colette, who's the director of the Review Panels Division, is on the line, so I'll pass the mic to her for the response.
Thanks, Connor. Can you just confirm that you can hear me?
We can hear you, yes, go ahead.
Perfect, thank you so much. So as Connor indicated, we have in the past conducted joint review panels with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission under our former legislation. And in those cases, we were reviewing two different types of projects within the nuclear sector. I would classify or sort of characterize it as. We've reviewed a number of new nuclear facilities, so requests by proponents to expand or develop existing reactors. And we also reviewed a proposal put forward by the Ontario Power Generation to develop a deep geologic repository for low and intermediate level radioactive waste. So those assessments were completed under our former legislation, and all of the key documents that were submitted as part of that assessment are available on the Canadian Impact Assessment Registry. And I'm not sure who it was that asked the question, but I'm sure if you were to follow up with Connor or with our colleagues who are in the room, they would be able to point you in the right direction on our registry in terms of how to find that documentation. Thank you.
Well, did you have any follow-up questions? You're okay. Does anyone else in the room have a question? I'll make my way over to you. I might as well, actually. Why not?
Yes, thank you. My name is Norm Bush. I'm councillor for the City of Dryden. I've got two questions for Lise. One is a technical question, I guess, just to round out my understanding of the storage of the proposed storage of nuclear waste in the DGR. You'd mentioned different layers of protection around these fuel pellets. One of the last was the bentonite clay. Is it the intention to have the storage basically be a dry storage? And is the bentonite clay, what's the extent of the bentonite clay? Does it fill up the whole cavity, or will there be open spaces in the DGR?
So thank you for that question, and I believe I heard it all. There's a bit of an echo here, but so you were asking about the bentonite clay and what was the extent of that. So yeah, it's unfortunate I don't have the picture to put back up again. So there are a couple layers of bentonite within each emplacement room. Sorry, I'm getting feedback here. So each of the used fuel canisters is put within a bentonite buffer box. And if you may have noticed on that picture, then the various bentonite buffer boxes that are stacked up within a room, they also have another bentonite layer around them as well. I must say I don't remember exactly, and maybe Joe Heil, who's in the room there, will remember, but I think there still is some space around the ultimate bentonite layer within the emplacement room itself compared to the rock walls. I think there is some space there at the top, but again, Joe could definitely confirm that.
Where are you? Joe, over there. I'll make my way to you, don't worry. Oh, wonderful.
Get saturated, and at that point it actually starts swelling and actually apply pressure to the containers.
I believe we have a follow-up as well, Tyler.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to get some clarity on that. My second question, Lise, is I've read a number of comments around over the last while that we're kind of the guinea pigs in Canada with respect to a DGR. But having said that, I understand that both Finland and Sweden are more advanced than Canada in terms of progressing with the DGR. I wonder if you could comment on that, and also you mentioned the international experience that the NWMO would be drawing on, and how and if you're going to be interacting with Finland and Sweden on their projects as well in the potential design of a DGR in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll say a couple things on that. So absolutely, as it relates to used fuel, Finland is the most advanced in terms of the DGR. They're currently in the process of constructing that DGR, and they are moving towards an operating license and operation, I believe, in either 2024 or 2025. I may be slightly wrong on that date, but Finland is quite advanced. And actually, if you go to their website, Posiva, Posiva, they've got some really great videos as well of the underground and the work that they're doing in Finland. Sweden recently approved the site for their used fuel DGR. I'll come back to Sweden in a minute. And then just about a week or two ago, Switzerland as well announced their site for their facility. But the other thing I would just say, so that's on the used fuel piece. But there are several other countries that already have operating repositories for low and intermediate level waste, sometimes just for low, sometimes for intermediate, sometimes a combination. And so we can also draw on that experience. So for example, Sweden has had an operating repository for low and intermediate level waste for quite a while now, I believe, dating back, well over, I believe, 20 years. And Korea has one for low and intermediate level waste. So there are operating repositories of various depths internationally, mostly for low and intermediate level waste, except for Finland, as I say, will be the first for fuel. In terms of us drawing on that international experience, we absolutely do in all facets of our work. But I'll speak specifically to Finland because that was part of your question. So we have colleagues within our engineering and geoscience groups that have been working internationally with all of the research that's gone on internationally. That includes Finland, also includes Switzerland and other countries. So when we talked about bentonite earlier, for example, they work internationally with various organizations that are looking at bentonite. and the properties of bentonite and how best to construct the buffer boxes. They also work internationally with copper coatings and groups that are looking at and researching the best way to apply copper coatings and all of that. Same thing in terms of the engineering design. But I'd say the other piece too is we're certainly as well working with colleagues internationally to understand the processes that they're following and the work that they do for engagement with communities, for how are they making their decisions, what kind of agreements are they striking with communities. So we absolutely are very tied into that international experience, and we continue to keep abreast with everything they're doing. And I'd say, I guess the last one I would mention as well is the UK. The UK is also currently going through a siting process. They currently have 4 locations that they're investigating. I recently spoke with my counterpart in the UK. So we absolutely stay very connected to what's going on internationally. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, and thank you. Those were great questions.
Great, thank you. Brenane Lloyd from Northwatch. So just an added detail to Lisa's response on Finland, and I think Pasivia is here tomorrow, but they submitted their application in late December 2021, so I think a 2024 timeline is not what Pasivia will answer when you put that question to them tomorrow. I think it'll be several years at least. Sweden applied in 2011, it's 2022, and they're still in the licensing process. But my question is, I think, for Connor, and I'm interested in knowing whether the Impact Assessment Act will have more rigor than we saw with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act in the review of the Deep Geological Repository for low and intermediate level waste. And Lise may add to this, she was with Ontario Power Generation managing the Western Waste Management Facility at the time, so we'll also remember the details. OPG had submitted their environmental impact statement in 2011 for operating waste. In the Pickering licensing hearing in May of 2013, it slowly came out that OPG also intended to deposit their decommissioning waste in that deep geological repository, which would double the volume and would change the waste mix, because the mix of low and intermediate level waste would be quite different. Intermediate level waste, more highly radioactive and so on. So we got to the hearing in 2013, September 2013, and that hearing went from September till the following September, all based on the original submission, the impact assessment environmental impact statement, as if the DGR, now withdrawn, so it's a bit moot, but I think it's a good example of where the act lacked rigor because the project changed significantly, but we went through the hearing as if it had not. Has anything changed under the Impact Assessment Act, the new act, that would protect the process and the public and bring more rigor to the project review, so the project couldn't double in size or fundamentally change, but carry on under the old impact statement? Is there a change?
Sure. So I'm going to refer that question actually to my colleague Robin Lynn Virtue, who worked on the.
She was there.
Yeah. So Robin, take it away.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I apologize. I am not in Dryden, and I'm back in Ottawa, and my camera, I've been trying to get it to work for the past 20 minutes. It was working, so I apologize you don't actually see me physically, but I'm glad you can hear me. I just want to clarify that the old process under SIA 2012 was very rigorous and did cover all the aspects of the environmental assessment process. Back then, the panel did have a chance to consider all the information at the time, and didn't consider the other different waste streams and the different waste inventories. And OPG, we did get information on the additional waste inventories at the time, and the panel did have the additional information, and I just want to clarify that. And so I would say that the new act will be robust and have the ability to take into the any information that will be submitted to it by the NWMO about waste inventories that will be coming out of the nuclear reactors. At this point in time, we don't have a project description. We don't have what the volumes of waste that will be coming out and will be considered for the deep geological repository. So we can only go with what we're given at the time when we're provided a project description. So, I mean, to your question, Brene, we will, rigorously review the information that's provided by the NWMO. The panel will review it. If it feels like it needs more information to clarify waste inventories, it will request additional information and continue to do so until it's satisfied it has the information it needs to make recommendations to the government, in council, or governor and council. So I think I'll stop there.
Wonderful. I actually have my own follow-up question, and then I will pass the microphone on. But it's specifically, I'm Ethan. I'm hosting the panel discussion tonight. I'm going to be the moderator for the event, and I actually don't have the assessment agency as part of my panel this evening. And I have one burning question that's kind of a follow-up actually to what Brene asked, and that's I love the idea of the act itself, but I don't necessarily have a lot of clarity on the accountability of a party to you as the assessment provider, if that makes sense. Like, are you just in charge of collecting information and presenting it to the NWMO as an actor here, or are they accountable to the assessment that you make in some way under the Assessment Act itself?
Sure. So it's actually the first kind of collection of information is the NWMO in that phase 2. In the impact statement phase, it's the NWMO that will collect information on potential impacts and submit their impact statement to the panel. And then in the case of a panel assessment, as I've noted, it's an independent panel of experts that will conduct the impact assessment. The impact assessment agency is available to provide support for, organizing hearings, using our registry, et cetera, and to provide input, but we're just another participant really in the process. But in those public hearings, that's where the proposal from the NWMO is really kind of put to the test, if you will. That's where we get public input, Indigenous input, federal expert input, other experts, provincial experts, and that's sort of the accountability mechanism of the NWMO anticipates X effects, and then so in the impact assessment process, led by the panel, those assertions made by the proponent will really be put to the test, and ways that we could mitigate or reduce those negative impacts are sought and found. And then another key feature is that when Governor and Council ultimately makes a decision, that decision statement will include legally binding conditions that in phase 5, in the last phase, the Impact Assessment Agency will be verifying. So there will be, site inspections to make sure that those conditions are being met. And so to the original question, it's not in the proponent's interest to propose one thing and then change the project midway through, because ultimately the project that would lead to being approved is the project that would need to be carried out. That's the approved project. So if the NWMO were to propose one thing and want to do something else, that something else may not be approved, and they may not be allowed to do that. So that's why it's important to have a transparent and clear process of what is being proposed, what are the potential impacts, and then the review panel and the public hearing is meant to bring light, kind of, what's the word? Something about sunlight is the best disinfectant. So it's a very transparent process, so that you know, all participants have access to the same information, and will hear both the proponents' views and the views of experts.
I have a question here behind me, and then I'll come pass the microphone over here.
Roger Nesbitt, City of Dryden CAO. I want to thank all the speakers, presenters this morning, and for the rest of the forum for that matter. I have two questions, one for Julia and one for Connor. So Julia, I'll start with yours first. You spoke about environmental monitoring. Can you elaborate on that for us, how long that the monitoring would be in place and what exactly the CNSC would be monitoring?
I can get started on this. So the licensee is required to monitor their environment as part of their license conditions. So before the project begins, they have to collect a baseline study, and then during the operation of the facility, they have to do ongoing measurements of key parameters. So think uranium concentration in the air, chlorine in the water, that kind of information. At the same time, CNSC has something called an independent environmental monitoring program that independently verifies the information proposed that is measured by the licensee. So they check the water, we send our own people, we collect independent water samples and compare the two. And that information is posted on the website. There is a second aspect there about long-term monitoring, and if the facility undergoes closure and it's released from jurisdiction, who monitors the project? So there's a recent standard called CSA N292.7, which outlines requirements for deep geological facilities. Part of that is monitoring, and in it stipulates that monitoring must occur throughout the entire lifespan of the facility. Who conducts the monitoring changes depending on the licensing phase. So during operation, it's NWMO, but past closure, they may be released from licensing controls, in which case the provincial government may take over monitoring. But no matter what, throughout the lifespan of the facility, in going into the post-closure phase, so after they've sealed the shaft and 200 years in the future, monitoring still will occur of the environment to verify that the DGR is safe.
Thank you. Connor, this one's for you, I guess. As you know, this project is drawing attention from across the country, attention from both supporters of the project and opposition. Through the impact assessment and the public engagement, is there any processes or protocols in place that would put an emphasis on local area residents' concerns or wants or needs in regards to this project? Or are they held at the same level as the rest of the Canadian public would be?
Sure. So I will. I'll refer that question actually to my colleagues from Review Panels Division.
Thanks, Connor. Colette Spaniolo here. So yes, there is opportunity within the review panel process to ensure that members of the local communities that are most likely to be affected by a proposed project have an opportunity to have their voices heard. In particular, the public hearing, which is a key component of the integrated assessment process, those hearing sessions are typically held in the communities that are most likely to be impacted by the project. So depending on where the final site selection decision is made by the NWMO, the review panel would work with those communities to schedule and to hold public hearings. And there's different types of sessions, as Connor had mentioned during the presentation, that can be held. Everything from general sessions where local residents can bring their views forward, to technical sessions, which may involve experts from across the country, as well as sessions specifically with Indigenous groups to make sure that there's opportunities that are culturally appropriate for potentially affected groups to have their views and concerns heard as well. Now, generally speaking, the impact assessment process, it isn't a it isn't a numbers game. We're not looking at how many comments are coming in from across the country expressing support or expressing concerns with a project. We're really looking at the quality of the information that's coming in, and the review panel weighs that information. So, you know, in that regard, a submission that comes in from a local resident who has direct local knowledge about the environment, about the potential effects to a specific community, could be given very, very high weight. You know, at the same time, an expert who perhaps lives in a different part of the country, but who has, you know, very valuable information about the potential effects of this type of a project on a particular component of the environment, that information could also be given high weight. So at the end of the day, it really is about the type of information that's being submitted. And I would also just add that the Impact Assessment Act does place particular emphasis on considering local and community knowledge as well as Indigenous knowledge in the assessment. So from that perspective, yes, the views and the concerns, the wants and the needs of the communities that are most likely to be affected of a project do play quite heavily into the IA process. Thank you.
I'm Marilyn Billsburg. My question is back about the DGR that's being built right now in Finland. I'm just wondering if somebody could confirm how far the high-level nuclear waste is being transported from the nuclear power plant to the DGR, as opposed to Canada, where ours would be coming from New Brunswick, Quebec, Southern Ontario, and I think a little bit from Manitoba. If somebody could confirm the transportation destination distances.
I'll start, only because I've been there, specifically the Deep Geological Repository in Finland. I just saw their visitor center. I didn't go in the facility itself. But next to so the visitor center is sort of overlooking two existing nuclear power plants, and then one that they're building, Olkiluoto 3, I think. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but I can't really answer your question. So there's 3 nuclear power plants, 2 that are operating and 1 that's not, that are in very close proximity to the Deep Geological Repository. The other, I don't know where there's other nuclear power plants in Finland, so I can't really answer your question specifically.
So it's Lee's, and I was just trying to Google the actual distance just so that I could answer that question. But sorry, it's not coming up very quickly for me. But so yeah, Finland does have 5 reactor units, operating reactors in 2 main locations in the country, in Loviisa and Olkiluoto. And sorry, it'll just take me a moment to try to find that distance, but the exact distance between those facilities. So certainly there will be transportation from Loviisa to Olkiluoto. And I'll just, sorry, my Google isn't working quickly enough for me to find that distance.
I think we have an answer, and we can then probably ask tomorrow during the post-EVA presentation as well.
Yeah, I'm not finding it very quickly, so apologies for that.
Hi, I'm Joel Bergstaller. I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about the Yukon here and their new regulations that they have put in place for environmental assessments, where they hold, I guess, the proponent responsible for all financial costs to do with cleanup. I'm just thinking future here, if you mentioned upon closing of the DGR a transfer to the province of responsibility for monitoring. I'm wondering, is there a mechanism in place in Ontario and or Canada to hold the generators of this waste responsible for any cleanup that may happen for the foreseeable future?
Hello? Oh, okay, there we go. So there is something called the financial guarantee, which for any large nuclear facility, so think a nuclear power generating station or a uranium mine and mill, they have to have the funds available to perform decommissioning activities if they're to go bankrupt. So at any time during the process, if they go bankrupt, the CNSC has the ability to liquidate the funds in order to ensure that any project is cleaned up. In the case of the NWMO, it's a little bit curious because they are funded under a contribution agreement where the power producers, so Hydro-Quebec, OPG, AECL, the people that actually made the waste, contribute money into the nuclear waste fund. NWMO then access this fund to continue to perform the activities that they continue to construct the DGR. Part of that money is also included, so OPG gets money, it puts into the fund, and the fund's there to power fund the project. In the future, the fund still exists. There's no time limit on how much money goes into it. There is a large surplus of fund, and they have to continue to contribute to the fund every year that they operate. So long story short, yes, that they'll have money in the future because there's a bank, sort of say, to ensure that they are funded through the closure of the facility up until monitoring. And I can't speak to any future law, but let's say the NWMO is no longer needed, which I do not know such scenario, and everything's closed at the DGR. This nuclear waste fund will still exist where the power producers still have to contribute to it in order to make sure that any activity needed retrieval or monitoring is funded for. And in such case that there is no funding, the federal government also supplies its own money to ensure that decommissioning activities are undertaken, or in this case, monitoring.
So it's Lise, I'll just add to that. That's very correct in the sense that, again, we need to be able to ensure that the funds are set aside for the project through its entire life cycle. And so when you hear us talk about a $26 billion project, that's over the entire life cycle, over 100 years of the project. Actually more than 100 years. So the funds are already set aside for that entire period of time for both the upfront regulatory approvals process, the construction, the design, the operations, and even, and this was mentioned earlier, the post-monitoring phase. So the funds are already there, and we have to update those estimates of costs every 5 years. And as was mentioned earlier as well, there's a funding formula in terms of how NWMO is funded. And I'll just speak to Ontario specifically, but similarly, there are similar provisions within New Brunswick, Quebec, etc. But in Ontario, through the Ontario Financing Authority as well, the waste owner, in this case OPG, has to also submit cost estimates every 5 years, and that gets verified and challenged and validated by the Ontario Financing Authority, and our facility also feeds into those estimates. So there is an ongoing cycle in which the estimates are updated and that they're verified, they're validated, and then back to what the CNSC just said, when you would have an operating facility, there's also a need to on an ongoing basis, demonstrate a financial guarantee for the facility. And that's information that an operator or a proponent would have to provide on a routine basis. So there's always this ongoing scrutiny to ensure that you have sufficient funds set aside, not just for the current operation, but for all future operations and activities that would be required.
I'll make a comment on that because basically we pay for it anyway, no matter how you look at it. Because even right now, we contribute so much from our electricity bills to go into the fund. That goes to OPG. OPG then puts it into something which pays the NWMO and so forth. And if there's anything left over, we pay for it no matter where the money comes from. It's in a sense called crowdfunding or taxes, whichever you like.
Just to respond to that, as a ratepayer, and I'll speak to Ontario, as a ratepayer of electricity in Ontario, you have funded this plan, that is correct. Now, the funds are already all set aside, so there aren't currently contributions having to be made to the fund. So you're not paying right now, but certainly in the past, as part of being a ratepayer in Ontario, yes, that's absolutely true. But again, I would just point out that those cost estimates, I mean, they're expected to be done at a fairly quite high level of scrutiny. They're reviewed routinely, and the intent is as well to make sure that the plan is being done in a fiscally prudent way as well, so that you're not overburdening Ontarians, ratepayers, etc., but also so that we're not passing on the financial burden to future generations as well.
In the essence of time, because we are at 11 o'clock right now and we have a quick break, I have one last question that was submitted. Is there special training for first responders to attend a potential accident site? If so, what is the training, who will provide it, and who will pay for it?
Maybe I can start, and then Lise, perhaps you can add at the end. So the CNSC, it's not my team that does this, by the way. It's our Emergency Management Preparedness Division who does this training. They offer it to first responders, typically professional and volunteer fire departments, but also police services as well if they're interested. And we do this, I believe it's upon request, so if they're interested, they can get this training from us. And it's free of charge, the training that we offer. We send the specialists. I don't have the details on how long it takes and things like that because it's not my team that does that, but so we offer it as a service. We have done it for areas, for example, I believe, and Raj or Francois, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think like Thunder Bay, North Bay, and I'm not sure, I can't remember if Kenora was on the list or not, but there's definitely been, I think they're called hazmat level 3 capability centers that have been trained by our emergency preparedness in the past. I'm not sure about Kenora, that's the only one.
And I will just also briefly add that as a requirement for licensing, the NWMO must ensure that there is local capabilities to address any accident. So firefighters, health professionals, there has to be enough resources to address any potential accident. It is.
Yeah, so I'll just add a little bit to that. And so a couple things. So first of all, once you're into the operations phase and you actually have an underground facility, then you're going to require mine rescue on site. So you need the capability to do mine rescue, just like in any underground mine. And that would be provided, and those people would be employees of NWMO and trained and working at the site. And you'd have to have agreements, just like other mines, with mine rescue capabilities across the province. There would also, when you're in the operations phase, be emergency response on site and people that are trained in emergency response at the site, again, that are employees. When you're in the construction phase, similarly, just like any construction site, you would need to have the ability for emergency response on site, medical response, those kinds of things. Specific to first responders, I think that was more specifically about the question. So in addition to what was just said, so as the operator, we would be working with first responders, not just in the local area, but also along the transportation route. And as required, if we needed agreements with local, again, fire departments or things like that, we would set up those agreements with the local fire department and provide capacity to support those agreements. And then the only other thing I'll just mention is that, so again, in terms of first responders along a transportation route, and I am speaking here to my previous experience with OPG, where we did a lot of transportation of radioactive materials. So we would routinely meet with first responders along the transportation routes, provide them information about how the transportation works, what the regulations are around the transportation. And they would also quite often, well, more locally, I think, to the stations, we would run drills in terms of transportation emergency response. And the local responders could participate as well in those drills. So for transportation, there's a significant transportation emergency response plan that has to be in place and that has to be drilled routinely, and that ties back to agencies, not just like the CNSC, but also Transport Canada and other things as well. So there's various layers for sure of emergency response at the various phases of the project. And certainly as a proponent, we would have to demonstrate that we have all of that in place.
Just one last one, and it's an important one. And I think this is probably for Eric, you may be able to answer this. Are there nuclear products currently being transported in Canada, and are they making their way through our community today? And maybe you can speak to just how, like the severity or the level of radioactiveness, if you will, of those products.
There are a significant amount of nuclear substances that are transported throughout Canada on a daily basis, and they range right from medical isotopes to hospitals, from the production facilities to low-level, intermediate-level nuclear waste to high-level waste, including used fuel. So right now in Canada, while we don't ship the same sort of amounts and frequencies that is being proposed by the NWMO in the future, there are on occasion used fuel shipments done in Canada, and those have been done safely. So one of the things, though, is as the regulator, we don't regulate the routes, and I'll caveat that with the routes when they are category 1, 2, or 3 material, such as used nuclear fuel, which would be category 2 material. It actually needs to have a transport security plan, which I mentioned in my presentation. They would need to do a threat and risk assessment, and in that threat or risk assessment, the proponent or the licensee analyzes the routes, and then our nuclear security division reviews them. So while we don't prescribe the routes, we can influence them if it requires a transport security plan. So again, keep in mind that some of this material, the routes and the agendas and the timing and the schedules is not information that is released to the public. However, it would release to organizations that would be on a need-to-know basis, for example, like local police or something like that. So I would argue there are a lot of shipments happening in Canada. I don't regulate, the CNSC doesn't regulate the routes, so we can't say for sure that they're going through here, but the other thing too is, you know, we're all smart people. We also know how the highways work in Canada. It's a large country, so you can, you know, you can think about it yourself and figure it out. Sorry.
Thank you, everybody, for the questions. Thank you to all the speakers for answering the questions. I know there was a few questions about international projects happening. We do have PSEBA coming tomorrow morning at 8:30 for a presentation to go over their project and the current status of the project. For now, we'll take a 10-minute break, go stretch your legs, grab some coffee, grab some tea, and feel free to visit one of the information booths and speak to some of the presenters and their peers. We'll see you back in about 10 minutes. Thank you.